Welcome back again. You're still watching us here on Cairo Local Time. As I have mentioned earlier, we will be focusing on the first Russian African Economic Forum, which is expected to kick off on an official level in Sochi in Russia on the 24th and 25th of October. And I'm very much delighted to have joining me this afternoon here in the studio to shed further light and give more in-depth analysis about not just the importance of this summit, but also the Russian interest in the African continent and the strengthened bilateral relations between Egypt and Russia, which has been ongoing for very long years, and their coordination and their parallel alignment when it comes to various numbers of issues and files, whether it's economic or on the political level. I'm very much delighted to have with me Mr. Mohamed, who is the Managing Director at Al Ahram newspaper. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me.
This is the first, as I said, of its kind, a first economic forum between Russia and the entire African continent. If you were to talk about the significance of this event, what can you tell us?
I think, this move is another indication of the rise of the role of Russia under Vladimir Putin. I think everyone is quite following with admiration how Russia under Putin is actually getting more engagement with the Middle East via the door of Syrian crisis. Now Vladimir Putin is actually opening the African continent, trying to increase the engagement with the whole of African countries via the economic forum, which is the first step ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union to have such gathering. And the response was quite phenomenal, because out of 57 countries, 50 leaders of African countries are actually going to participate in this summit.
Mm-hmm. Now, because of the importance of, not just the strategy that Putin is applying when it comes to his foreign policy, but all eyes are on the African continent. We've seen other countries, whether it's China, the United States, or any other entities around the world who are focusing on the development on China, on helping this, rather African continent, and also helping in preserving the resources. So what will Russia come in terms of agreements or some kind of cooperation that would bind in together the African states?
Actually, we are noticing, from a while, what I call it, the rush to Africa. Not only, the Japanese or Chinese, the Indian, and South Korean. Now we are seeing, Russia is actually taking a very concrete steps to raise its engagement and also its cooperation and its benefit from this virgin continent. There is a huge room for Russia to move. If we just look to the figures, the trade relation between Russia and the whole continent is around 20 billion US dollar, which is half of the trade of France. It's 1/10 of China trade relation with the continent. Africa is actually having a lot of resources, untapped resources, and it needs a lot of things. Not only security or or energy or other things, but also needs a lot of mega infrastructures. And Africa do have a growing middle class, which they need a lot of things. So there is the potential.
The potential is quite vast.
Yeah.
Yes, and well, The president of Egypt is heading the African Union, and the African Union is a very prestigious, important international organization that not only brings under its umbrella the entire African continent states, but also common agendas and visions and challenges and obstacles. I am sure that the president will be reflecting back on the developments, on the updates that have been taking place during the entire year's Egypt's presidency within this context. But what will, in return, Russia be able to do to help in overcoming these challenges in Africa, name it poverty, empowering women, the education improvement, and so forth?
I think, you know, Russia, President Putin already gave an interview to Russian news agency and touched specifically regarding what you are asking for. He said that, you know, Russia is ready to make multi-billion projects with African countries. Second, Russia is ready to train and raise a lot of calibers and leaders for the African countries. And the other things which is, you know, the most important, he said, you know, our project is not going to have any political or whatever
ideologies,
things attached. So he is trying to, you know, to make the African countries a little bit more relaxed and not panic regarding why this more interest, Russian interest of Africa. And another thing which is Russia could actually contribute by trying to mediate and solve, you know, some conflicts.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, sir, because while it should be a win-win situation and while there should be an ongoing mutual cooperation between both the African continent and Russia, it's only very logical to ask how will the Russians benefit from this economic forum?
I think, you know, first of all, you know, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is a sign and important declaration that Russia is back to the international stage as a big power, having a lot of connections and a lot of involvement. So after the Middle East, now Russia is actually increasing its presence in Africa. This is number one. Number two, we have to make sure that, you know, Russia is different from the Soviet Union. You know, Russia under, you know, Vladimir Putin, very pragmatic, less ideological. So what we are seeing, you know, it's you know, a movement from Putin to increase, you know, the interest and the benefit for Russia, but also mutual benefit between his country and the other. Because frankly speaking, you know, Africa do have a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of partners and a lot of players who are interested and willing and rushing to do business with Africa. So the Russians, they have to distinguish themselves, especially, you know, with the Chinese. You know,
yes, it is a big market and competition.
Because China is taking Africa by storm.
Definitely, but again, I mean, as a journalist working in this field for years, is it really possible to sort of differentiate or put aside economy from politics? Does a good economic relation between nations determine or specifically means that they are also on equal level of political abiding, or they can be different? We can have different policies or different political interests, but still keep our economic ties. How can that take place?
You know, I think, you know, the Chinese experience is actually is a good reflections. You know, because the history or the track record of international or foreign intervention in domestic affairs or in the internal affairs is not so pretty, to say the least. You know, I think, you know, the American intervention or, you know, the French actually contributing to complicate, you know, the domestic affairs. So a lot of African and more countries, they want to make only business, you know, and
Africa is rich in resources by all means. It's the future of
yeah,
of everything.
Yeah, and also it's a huge market. You know,
It
if we are speaking about, you know, the whole of the continent, we are speaking about maybe more than 600 million. So it is a huge market. You know, still Africa needs a lot of mega project, you know, infrastructure, transportation, whatsoever.
Now, I was also going to ask you about the fact that if we recall back in history, this is possibly the only time that Egypt was ever at its strongest position and partnership with the African continent. We see that on the sidelines of this summit, President Sisi again is meeting with these heads of African states. And the kind of collaboration and cooperation that is ongoing between Egypt and the rest of the African states is at its peak levels. So again, what does this signify in terms of the relationship that is between Egypt and the rest of the African continent?
I think, you know, it's Egypt do have a historical relationship with Africa. We contributed a lot, you know, to the independence and the well-being of Africa, and we for some time we didn't engage with Africa heavily, but now there is a huge understanding and consensus among, you know, the Egyptian elites that, you know, Africa is our backyard, and our you know, is very important for the national interests of Egypt, and also it's, you know, the natural extension for Egypt, because if Egypt, by the end of the day, it's an African country, and we are very proud that we are an African country. So a lot of people now understand fully that there is a bright future for Egypt in Africa, not only for our products or for our industrial things or agricultural things or our expertise, but also for our you know, capital, human capital resources. And we don't have any bad records in engaging with Africa, so we are welcomed from the African countries and African elites, because they are considering Egypt as one of the champion of their independence, and now Egypt is helping with other, you know, to in this big fight, which is, you know, the fight of development.
On the other side, or on the other hand, Egypt and Russia also have very strong bilateral relations. We've seen during the presidency of President Sisi running office, there's been a number of bilateral talks being held between President Sisi and Putin on various occasions, whether it's direct official visits here and there or on the sidelines of major conferences. Again, what does this signify about two things: the Egyptian-Russian relations and the Egyptian foreign policy in general?
You know, in a very clear sign, you know, by the end of the day, Egypt is a very strong and very important country in Africa and also in the Arab world. And Russia is, by the end of the day, you know, it is a former superpower. Now it is recovering. now it is trying to restore its image and its own capabilities. So there is...
and it has a strong position in the United Nations as well.
Yeah, and there is a big history, a lot of interest and mutual interest between these two big countries. And, you know, Egypt needs Russia and Russia needs Egypt. So
it's a mutual benefit,
yeah,
mutual
it's
understanding.
natural, you know, because we are not inventing, you know, this relationship. This relation is
ongoing.
Yeah.
Now, my final question: a final communique is expected to conclude from this first summit ever. If I were to ask you from your vast experience and analysis, what would be the main points in this final communique in terms of possibly steps or committees or actual concrete developments taking place on the ground as a result of this forum?
I think, you know, it is very easy to expect that, you know, they are going to state that, you know, they are going to fight a lot of other things which is contributing to you know, to the you know, interior
internal,
threats.
yes, of course.
Yeah. And Russia is going to use this opportunity to declare very clear things regarding projects which is going to do
major transformation.
Yeah, to do it with Africa. Not only just, you know, a general statement. It's going to have
detailed,
very specific details regarding, you know, the projects. And the most important elements from a political point of view, I think they are going to emphasize that, you know, we are going to cooperate without intervening in the in the domestic affairs of Africa, and we are going to respect, you know, the African interests. We would like to, you know, to be your partner in an equal footsteps.
Definitely. And of course we will be watching on this summit that will be kicking off on Wednesday and Thursday in the Russian city of Sochi. Our time is up, unfortunately. I would like to thank you very much once again, Mr. Mohamed Sabrin, Managing Director at Al Ahram newspaper. Thank you very much for your time and patience. That brings us to the end of Cairo Local Time. Thank you for watching.